Quick question. If your car broke down this week, could you pay for the repair without putting it on a credit card? Because below a certain number, you aren't just budgeting, you're flinching. Every strange engine noise, every unexpected envelope, every payment notification feels slightly larger than it actually is. For many people, the first $5,000 is where one ordinary problem stops automatically becoming expensive debt. It doesn't make you wealthy, it changes the sequence. Before $5,000, problem, credit card, interest, and months of cleanup. After $5,000, problem, payment, done. Picture this. It's Sunday evening. Someone opens their banking app. Savings account, $5,140. 6 months ago, that same account said $310. Nothing about their income has changed. No bonus, no raise, no windfall. Same job, same rent, same everything. But somewhere in that climb, something quietly switched off. Not every financial worry, not every risk. One specific tripwire that used to turn an ordinary expense into a much longer problem. And that is what we're going to unpack. My name is Nick, and I spend a probably unhealthy amount of time thinking about money. Not in a, here are the top 10 dividend stocks kind of way. More in a, why does $5,000 feel like nothing on paper, but like everything in real life kind of way. Most financial content skips straight past the small numbers. It jumps to 6 figures, to 7 figures, to the milestones that sound impressive when you say them out loud. And I understand why. Those numbers are exciting. But today I want to get smaller, to the first real milestone most people cross, the one nobody puts on a poster, the one that happens quietly, usually before anyone even considers themselves a saver. Because something changes at $5,000. Not your net worth, not your lifestyle. Something underneath both of those things. Here's the assumption most people carry into this number, that $5,000 is basically nothing. It won't buy a house, it won't fund a retirement, it barely covers a used car. Compared to the milestones this channel usually talks about, $650,000, $1 million, $5,000 looks almost embarrassing to mention. So, people rush past it. They treat it as a rounding error on the way to something bigger. Get there fast, don't dwell, move on to the number that actually matters. Does that sound familiar? Treating the small number as barely worth naming? It's the most common mistake in this entire conversation, because that assumption skips the one thing $5,000 actually does, and it has nothing to do with what the money can buy. It has to do with what it turns off. Here's what $5,000 actually does, and it's more mechanical than people expect. A widely cited Federal Reserve survey on household finances has, in various years, found that somewhere around a third of American adults could not cover an unexpected $400 expense without borrowing, selling something, or going without. Not a $40,000 expense, $400. Below that kind of buffer, an unplanned expense doesn't get paid, it gets financed. The transmission dies, and instead of an appointment, it becomes a balance on a credit card at north of 20% interest. The dental bill doesn't get scheduled, it gets deferred until the pain wins, and then it goes on the same card. Call it a tripwire. Below roughly $5,000, almost every normal, unremarkable life expense, the categories that show up for basically everyone, every single year, sits above the buffer, which means the tripwire gets triggered constantly. Not because anyone is reckless. Because the wire is set too low for an ordinary life to avoid it. Consider 3 completely ordinary examples. A car repair, usually somewhere between a few hundred and a couple $1,000s. An unplanned dental or medical bill, in a similar range. A short gap in income after a job change or a delayed paycheck. None of these on their own are catastrophic. But stacked below a $5,000 buffer, each one becomes its own small emergency. And each one usually gets paid for by borrowing at the least favorable rate available. A credit card, because it's the fastest thing to reach for under pressure, not the smartest. At $5,000, for most households, that changes. This is roughly the range that covers the handful of shocks people actually experience in a typical year. Above it, the tripwire simply isn't there for most of what life throws at you. The wire didn't move. You grew taller than it. And here's the part with the actual number attached. Imagine a $1,200 car repair. Without a buffer, the repair doesn't necessarily end when the mechanic hands back the keys. It may follow your home as a credit card balance, At 22% of interest, a balance near $1,200 initially creates roughly $22 in interest every month as it stays near that level. The car is already fixed, but the repair is still charging you. With a $5,000 buffer, the expense still hurts. The account balance is still dropping, but the financial problem ends when the bill is paid. That is the overlooked return on the first $5,000. Not only interest earned, expensive interest avoided. So, if avoiding that tripwire is this valuable, why do so many people take years to build $5,000, even when they could technically get there faster? Researchers who study scarcity have a name for what happens to the brain when money is tight. They call it tunneling. When you're financially stretched, attention doesn't spread out and consider the future calmly. It narrows hard onto whatever's due this week. Rent, the card that's close to its limit, the bill that's now 3 days late. That narrowing isn't a character flaw. It's not laziness, and it's not a lack of discipline. Some of the research on this describes the effect on decision-making as comparable to losing a full night's sleep, not because anyone got less intelligent, but because a real finite resource, call it mental bandwidth, is being spent almost entirely on the immediate, with nothing left over for the important but not urgent. The faraway staff, an emergency fund, a retirement account, a 5-year plan, doesn't get ignored because people don't care about it. It gets ignored because it's genuinely outside the tunnel. Their attention is stuck inside. And here's the visceral part. Living inside that tunnel long enough starts to feel like a personality. People stop saying I'm having a hard stretch and start saying I'm just not a saver, as if it's who they are, instead of where their bandwidth currently sits. That's the identity cost nobody talks about. The tunnel doesn't just narrow decisions. Eventually it starts narrowing someone's sense of who they're allowed to become with money. The cruel part of tunneling is that it's self-reinforcing. The narrower someone's attention gets, the harder it becomes to do the one thing that would widen it again, setting up money aside in the first place. You can't calmly plan a 5-year career move when most of your mental energy is being spent surviving the next 5 days. But $5,000 doesn't pull someone completely out of the tunnel. It creates the first patch of peripheral vision. For the first time, one unexpected bill can arrive without consuming the next 3 months of attention. The entire horizon isn't visible yet, but every small shock no longer blocks it completely. Now, I want to stop here for a second, because there's an objection already forming. Nick, this sounds nice, but isn't this just spend less, save more? Haven't I heard some version of this 1,000 times already? Fair. And if that's all this was, I'd agree with you completely. But there's a specific reason simply knowing about tunneling doesn't actually get anyone out of it, and it's the same reason most advice about just start an emergency fund quietly fails, over and over, for perfectly smart people. I want to show you why, and then show you the version that actually works. Here's why just knowing about tunneling doesn't fix it. Tunneling happens precisely when attention and willpower are already scarce. So, a solution that requires more attention and more willpower, a strict budget, a spreadsheet updated every week, a promise to try harder, is asking the exact resource that's already depleted to somehow manufacture more of itself. That's not a discipline problem. That's asking someone standing inside a tunnel to widen it using only the flashlight currently pointed at their own feet. The version that actually works removes the need for willpower entirely. A small automatic transfer, moving the moment a paycheck lands. It happens before the money is even visible enough to compete for your attention. It doesn't require a decision each time. It doesn't require willpower each time. It requires setting it up once, on a calmer day, and then simply not touching it again. There's a useful concept from the economist Richard Thaler that fits exactly here: mental accounting. Thaler's observation was that people don't actually treat every dollar the same, even though, mathematically, a dollar is a dollar. Once $5,000 sits inside an account explicitly labeled safety or emergency, separate from the account groceries and rent come out of, people become dramatically less likely to spend it on non-emergencies, even though nothing physically stops them from doing exactly that. The label itself changes behavior. That's not a loophole or a trick. That's mental accounting working in your favor instead of quietly working against you, the way it usually does when every dollar sits in one undifferentiated pile. This is the same principle behind everything automation related this channel keeps coming back to, just showing up earlier here, at a smaller number, before any real buffer even exists yet. The system does the work precisely because it doesn't rely on the version of you that's currently under pressure. It relies on the version of you that set it up on a calm Tuesday, and then simply got out of its own way. Remember the tunnel from a few minutes ago, the narrowed attention, the peripheral vision that genuinely shrinks under financial pressure. Here's what actually widens it back out. It isn't motivation, it isn't a single breakthrough moment. It's the buffer itself, slowly doing its job in the background, week after an unremarkable week. Every time the automatic transfer lands and nothing bad happens because of it, the tunnel gets a little wider. Every small emergency that used to trigger the tripwire and now just quietly gets paid out of the buffer instead, widens it a little more. Not because the person suddenly became a different kind of thinker. Because the pressure that was narrowing their attention in the first place has genuinely, measurably gotten smaller. By the time someone crosses $5,000, most of them aren't thinking about it in these terms at all. They just noticed, on some ordinary week, that a bill which used to trigger a small spike of dread just didn't. That's not a coincidence, and it isn't a personality change. That's the tunnel, letting go, one automatic transfer at a time. So, back to that Sunday evening, the couch, the banking app, $5,140, up from $310 6 months earlier. Nothing dramatic happened in that window. No bonus, no inheritance, no sudden burst of discipline nobody had access to before. Just a transfer that moved automatically, week after week, mostly unnoticed, while life carried on exactly as it had before. But somewhere in that climb from $310 to $5,000, something quietly disarmed. The tripwire that used to turn every ordinary inconvenience into a balance on a credit card, it's still technically there, in the sense that unplanned expenses will always exist. It just isn't close enough to trip anymore. And the tunnel that narrows attention under financial pressure, it's still a real, well-documented thing, wired into how brains work under stress. It's just not gripping quite as tightly as it used to. This is the milestone that almost never gets talked about, because it doesn't look impressive on a screen. Nobody posts a $5,140 balance anywhere. It wasn't the number that changed, it was how ordinary Tuesdays started to feel. So, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely read every one of these. Have you crossed this one yet? The point where an unexpected bill stopped feeling like a small crisis and started feeling like just a Tuesday? Drop it in the comments, wherever you currently are on that climb. I'm curious how many people already crossed this line without ever putting a name on it. And if this was useful, subscribe, because this is the start of a specific ladder. We're building this channel, $5,000 today, then $15,000, which we already covered a couple of videos back, then $25,000, then $50,000 after that, each one doing something completely different to how money actually feels, not just what it can buy. We'll keep climbing, one honest number at a time. I'll see you at the next one.